what's the software stack there as far as what you can share, right? As far as the developers that you are supporting and trying to make more productive.
Yeah, so I work in our engineering system team that supports Azure and Windows developers. And so like for Windows, it is a lot of very homegrown internal tools. Like there are some unique complications of Windows development because it is very old code base. It is huge. It's, we believe the largest Git repo in the world, touched by thousands of developers, thousands of times a day. And so we have, very internal looking tools there. And then for Azure, Azure is wildly, heterogeneous. And so there's a huge suite of tools that people use across the org.
Nice. And how is that productivity engineering and just systems engine? What's the how is that organization structured? And I'm asking this because, I want for the audience to see like, hey, to ship a code base of this size and continuously innovate and create new features at this rate, at this scale, what it takes, right? It's not, it's not magic. There's not too many companies could do it so well at this scale, right? And I want to kind of share with folks watching, like, hey, how productivity engineering, what's the role there, how essential it is as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So our engineering system team that focuses on Windows is a few hundred developers. But that's looking at a whole suite of internal tools from release to IC developer tools. Our developer productivity team that's really focused on those IC day-to-day experiences, it's a couple of dozen people, and that has been growing over time. As we get more and more wins, as we show more and more value, that team is growing. But as you said, like these things take a lot of investment. They take sustained investment too. There are huge wins to have out of it, but they don't come free.
I don't know if you remember, you've been there for a long time, right? Do you remember when like the decision came from upper management that, hey, we should build a team around dedicated to productivity engineering and developer experience? Do you remember when that happened and how it came about? Was it one or a few things, or tell us that story there.
Yeah, it's actually relatively new. It is about 5 years ago is when our developer productivity team was formed. And so it's never too late to start. And for us, it really was about when our listening systems became mature enough that we really understood what that day-to-day pain was for our internal developers. It's, before then we would have been just like, throwing darts blind. And so but once we had enough listening channels where we could hear about what were those daily frustrations, we then knew like where we could target investments, and we knew a lot more about how we could measure the impact of whether or not those targeted investments were paying off. And so for us, like I said, it's about 5 years ago, and it really came as a function of putting more effort into listening to our customers. And my customers are the internal developers working on Windows.
Got it. And that's a great segue to this next topic. Before I do that, Justin, any questions we should?
One just came in. Yeah. So, this is interesting. Okay. What channels do you have? This is a good question to listen. In other words, how are you pulling data? Is it surveys, user research, metrics, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and jump in on that. And so, yes, like I think most of our industry peers, we do use a lot of satisfaction surveys. How satisfied are you with the engineering system you use? How satisfied are you with your job overall? Things of that nature. But that's just one small piece of the puzzle, I think. I think it is also incredibly important to do more like qualitative research. And so I spend a lot of time sitting down, talking with devs one-on-one, understand, where we can really like dive into the context of their pain a bit more, watching, their workflows and how they do it. And so that qualitative lens of one-on-one interaction, understanding the human pain, surveying in order to get some of those broad results. That's great. And then, we have a lot of advantages here at Microsoft in just that we control so much of the stack. Like our developers are, they're developing on the platform that we own. And so it is like we get all of that rich telemetry that's coming from the Windows platform. And as I mentioned, our tools are largely internal tools. And so we have all that rich telemetry coming from the tools running on that platform. And then with GitHub, we have all of the data from where all that source code is flowing. And so not only do we get great sentiment analysis, but we can triangulate that to just a wealth of telemetry from the platform all the way up to the source code repository.
Can you share some of the data that you look at that's been helpful for your team specifically? Where are you getting this data? Do you have any? You mentioned it's all homegrown. I'm assuming it's all homegrown tools, right? But if there's anything that you're using third party out there that you can share with the world, could be interesting as well.
Yeah. So the data that we are using, that I use sort of day to day, it is all internal, and it is usage data coming from our tools. It's usage data coming from the platform itself. We also at Microsoft, we have Viva Insights, which is looking at sort of anonymized O365 metadata. So we get lots of calendar data. So we do get a great picture of how people are spending their time. And that's sort of something I'm particularly passionate about as we look at, I think developers they're doing one of two tasks. It's either toil or they're doing something creative. And so I spend a lot of time measuring, what are where are people stuck in toil and how do we minimize that? And that comes from inefficient processes. It comes from bureaucracy, but it also comes from fighting against your tools. Every second that a dev is waiting for a local build to complete is a second the company has lit on fire. And so looking at build speeds and things of that nature, and also just looking at how often are devs having to context switch between different disjointed development tools. And then what does that cost to overall productive effort? And so I do look at a wide, array of things, but really looking at how devs are spending their time and where are their inefficient bottlenecks in that flow.
The context switching part is really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
We try to look at that heavily. How do you and I've seen different ways folks measure this right out in the wild with our partners. How do you guys do that? What are some metrics there?
We can actually directly measure context switches from, because through Windows telemetry, we see what apps are running in the background, and we can see when people have to switch between one app and the other. And that has actually been sort of a big win for us, is making targeted investments to cut that down. So when we look at developer workflows, we can see when they have to switch, from their code editor to something else. And we can say, all right, well, that's an opportunity to integrate those tools perhaps. Yeah. And we've done that. And so we've made targeted investments to bring code search and build and, test execution all into the IDE, in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code through extensions. And what we found is that as we create a more sort of consistent and, well-joined developer workflow, we have seen that not only do our developers spend more time developing, then we can actually see that the amount of their days that they are spending coding is up about 8% when they use this less disjointed workflow. But they're also happier developers, and so it's a win for the business and it's a win for our customers.
There's a question that's come in that's correlated to what you just said. And it's kind of going back to asking about the metrics and specifically around the surveying. The question is, are you able to correlate satisfaction with productivity, for instance, based on this data that you come up with? Okay.
So I will say, there's of course some nuance here. Productivity is a bit of an overloaded term. It means very different things to different people, and we can prove that with research. Between individuals, between different roles, individual developers and their managers often have a different definition of what is productivity. It is not one thing. It is a lot of things. There are many dimensions to productivity. But we do see that happier developers, there is a positive relationship between satisfaction of our developers, not just with their tools, but overall job satisfaction and the amount of sort of code they are producing, and how much of their day they are spending developing that code.
And my next question, you've answered some of this, right? We had a kind of a list of topics that we were going to go together. We kind of went off the script with the questions a bit, right? So, looking at just the impact on Windows developer productivity, what are some of the factors that you see out there just for your team and whatnot? And how do you remove and modernize those kind of inefficiencies?
Yeah, first you have to know what they are. And you can get that certainly through telemetry, but also the telemetry only tells you part of the story. You have to go and talk to people. Like the most important part of my job, I think, is me sitting down and talking one-on-one with people and really understanding, what that we're seeing in the telemetry is actually a problem and how do those problems, stack up against each other. But it's oftentimes our internal developer tools, they are very utilitarian, like they aren't thought of from the lens of having great user experience, and those things really matter. And it's because, again, like Windows is a very old source tree. Like you have a large number of internal Windows developers who own code that was written before they were born. And so as Windows has grown up, it's like we haven't always had the most modern experiences for our internal developers. Before our developer productivity team existed, Windows developers couldn't use IntelliSense. They actually couldn't in any meaningful way do reasonable code searches. Like the source tree was so big, we couldn't index it fast enough to do text searches very well. And everything was very command line based, and developers couldn't enjoy sort of some of the modern comforts of an IDE. And so looking at how we can improve just even the user experiences of our tools, and of course the performance of those tools are incredibly important. I don't know if I answered your question. I might have gotten a little off there.
No, it's great. I mean, this is all stuff that we want to talk about here, and and that's why we started this whole thing. There's no great one place to talk about this thing that, as you said, is fairly new, right? When we talked to Netflix a couple of weeks ago, they made it official, their productivity engine, around 5-6 years ago as well, right? Google wrote a book about it at around the same time. So it's all pioneering, it's all new stuff, right? And thanks for sharing all of that. You mentioned something about, you were looking at this shift to remote work, right? And impact of productivity. Did you see any interesting data or any interesting findings there?
Oh, yeah. We could have an entire session just on this. So for some historical context, Microsoft has traditionally had a culture where most people came into the office almost every day. It's maybe someone who worked remotely when they had to let the cable person in, but in general, everyone was in the office every day. And so when we had to shift to remote work, it was the first time for almost everyone, and we're all learning it together. And we're all doing it in the midst of an incredibly scary pandemic at the time. And so it was challenging. And so I became really interested in what are all the different factors that are impacting the productivity and well-being of our developers? Not just the tooling factors, do our tools hold up, but also what are those, social and psychological factors, the environmental factors, and how do those all impact productivity and well-being? And what we found very quickly is our tools held up. Developers could do their jobs. VPN largely worked. We had Teams and Zoom for collaboration. So it was technically possible to do our jobs. But there were these human factors that were causing a great deal of stress and was impacting our productivity. And it also really highlighted that productivity and output aren't the same thing. And so what we saw in the early, in the first couple of months of mandatory work from home is that output per developer had skyrocketed. And so tons of PRs were being completed. But I wouldn't actually say that we were being more productive because those PRs were coming at a huge sort of emotional and psychological cost. Developers were working far more days. They were feeling isolated and lonely. They were feeling disconnected from their team. And so what this really taught us is that we need to look at things through a more like holistic lens, where it's not just the tools that impact productivity, but we also have to look at our culture and our human processes around it. Because like developers are people too, and so the challenges and the benefits we saw from remote work were more human problems than they were technical problems. Just like one example of that has really stuck with me is we surveyed 5,000 engineers across Microsoft early into mandatory work from home. And we asked them, what are the top challenges you're facing? What are the top benefits you've seen? And how has your productivity changed? How has your satisfaction changed? And we took all of that data and when we crunched the numbers, we found that the most predictive factor of someone reporting that their productivity had decreased and their satisfaction was lower, the most predictive factor was that they rarely start meetings with informal small talk. And so just like, hey, how are you doing? How's the weather in Florida? That was more important to people's productivity and satisfaction than the quality of their internet connection or the reliability of their VPN. And I think that just really highlights to me how important thinking about the human factors are as well as the technical factors.
That's a great story and examples that you shared. And one thing that you mentioned that was really interesting was, you said folks during this pandemic got a lot of PR pull requests, right? A lot of code out, right? How was the quality of that code? And maybe are you guys doing anything to measure the quality of the code? How did you know, like, okay, hey, and I see it myself, right? Work from home, right? I don't have to commute, right? I could spend more time working, right? But how do you measure the quality of that, right? And is there anything you can share? I know going off topic here, but it was an interesting thing to kind of
Bruce throwing me some curveballs. So the only word that is tougher to define than productivity is quality, and it's. I'm actually working on a research project right now that looks into how do people define quality differently, and it means something different to everybody. And so one of the things that drives me a little bit nuts in my org is people will say, oh, we need to focus on quality, but that may mean something different to you than it does to me. And so that's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but there are. Like all things, there are some indications that the quality has suffered, and there's indications that quality has gone up. And it's like overall, I think we have seen particularly in the early days of the pandemic, our sort of service health metrics, our MTTX metrics were stable or improving. Our sort of bug counts were stable. I haven't been able to see any sort of causal relationship between mandatory work from home and quality one way or the other in the way that we have for productivity.
And it's a hard thing, it's a new thing. I look at and talk to the teams that are doing productivity engineering really well, right? We're talking about organizations with 150 plus devs dedicated to this. And one gentleman who is actually here, I won't give his name, he's like, hey, measuring acceleration is easy. Quality is hard, and it's like a really hard thing. And it's just like I said, it's all pioneering. We're all trying to figure this out together, the best way to do this, and that's kind of what we're here today.
Bruce, we've had a few questions come in that I think might be an interesting time to look at a few of them. One of these is it's difficult to identify the cost or potential benefit of addressing tech debt for a lot of organizations. Do you spend time identifying sources of tech debt that impact the engineering experience? I know Gradle has our own answer for this in the way that we look at things like avoidable failures and flaky tests. But that's a really good question to think about how part of that tech debt planning would be part of the productivity story at Microsoft.
Yeah, it's such a good question because it is such a hard problem. And, flaky tests, just like code churn, we look at how often do developers have to go back to code and how are those rates changing? And again, it sort of goes back to this definition of productivity. One of the things we found where there's the biggest difference in definition between managers and ICs is for ICs, it's the by IC, I mean individual contributors, individual developers. It is sort of like the maintainability, the evolvability of that code is like, how is it written in such a way that I don't have to go back to it? And that is pops high on how individual developers define productivity. Managers, not as high, because they're not the ones who have to go back and fix it and address that tech debt. And that like sort of tension, I think, is a pretty big problem. We don't admittedly do nearly a good enough job of explicitly planning around or including technical debt in our overall sort of developer productivity story. It's something we know we haven't quite matured to yet. We're working on it. Like we think we're pretty mature as a developer productivity org, but like we're still growing. And that is an area that is underserved by us right now.
I mean, shipping software at your scale, right? Tech debt. I mean, it's unavoidable, right? Even, Gradle. I mean, I hear the engineering teams, right, constantly, fighting, and where are the balances there, right?
Yep.
So, especially with code base, older than many people in the company.
It probably makes people feel better to know, like, hey, Microsoft even deals with this problem.
Yeah. It's a huge, because the code base is so old, like we're constantly cutting off code paths and having more dead code. And like, if you want to refactor Windows, that's going to take you thousands of developers, probably many years to do. Like it's a really tough problem, and we haven't quite solved it yet.
It's really interesting though to think about it at that scale. Talking about the usage, the metrics that we talked about before, you mentioned Windows has all this really great telemetry built into it because the UI is kind of so accessible. But the question was asked for companies that aren't developing in IDEs, and I'm going to assume you mean like in Microsoft IDEs or something like that. Are IDE usage metrics available to developer productivity teams outside of that tooling? I think what we're asking is, are there metrics that we can gather outside of the IDE experience that are important for productivity?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of it is sort of like per tool telemetry, and so it depends on your own tool chain. I do know that for Microsoft, at least, we are exploring how we can make some of these metrics perhaps more available. And if that's something that interests you, find me on LinkedIn. But it's like it really, if you're building your own tools, like you have to design them with telemetry in mind and make sure you have those right instrumentation points, because it's maybe tough to retroactively go and put those in. But it's, we are relying on combining telemetry coming from lots of different tools. And since we wrote them all, we wrote that telemetry in there. And if you're writing your own tools, add your telemetry. And if you're not, then it really depends on what tool chain you're using.
And I guess from our side, where we would say is that there's probably stuff that you could look at within the build tool chain as well, that aren't necessarily within the IDE. That might be if you're building remotely or in CI or something like that, you're able to pull metrics from there that might be useful as well. We recommend some of that. Then the last one before I let you all get back to the main track here. What about tools for pairing remotely, for doing paired code or anything like that? Is anything you can recommend that's been effective for your teams?
I will say that one of the biggest challenges of this shift to remote work is how do we continue to do sort of creative collaborative work? One of the things I heard in some of my interviews is like, you can no longer get a bunch of nerds, around a whiteboard to sort of sketch things out, and like you can't just stop in someone's office to help do some pair programming. And so there are things like LiveShare with Visual Studio. And so like we do have some tools for that. I don't know that we quite have sort of the human processes and experiences around that yet. I think we're still learning. But LiveShare with Visual Studio is one tool. And then we do lots of just screen sharing with Teams and things of that nature. But we're still learning.
The next one that I had on my list was, what was, just in your productivity journey last couple of years, what was maybe one or two of the biggest bottlenecks that were hindering productivity and where developers were spending their time?
Yeah. like we certainly touched on one earlier, and just like our workflow was incredibly disjointed. And so we saw as we created a more unified workflow, that reduced a lot of bottlenecks that just came from context switching, which oftentimes required like manually carrying data from one application to another because those things weren't well integrated. And just like to talk a little bit about the scale of that impact. Like that doesn't seem like a big thing. It's like, oh, you took a bunch of disjointed tools and you sort of plug them in together. But we saw by doing that sort of the amount of time per day that developers spend actually developing as opposed to maybe fighting against their tools, it increased 8% causally 8% as a result of that, which when you look at the number of developers we have, that is tens of millions of dollars of additional development capacity to the org every year. And it's not just that those developers then are, quote unquote, more productive, but they're happier. They are more likely to stay at Microsoft. And there's some indications that they write higher quality code. And so like this stuff is just so important. And so reducing, context switches, that was one bottleneck. And another place that we continue to focus heavily is around build performance. And it's like I said, whether your builds take 30 seconds or they take 5 minutes, like if I'm just sitting there waiting for a build to complete, there's not a ton else I can do. And that is just completely unproductive time. It's frustrating. And it's just, like I said, it's lighting that time on fire. And so, we continually look at how we can improve, particularly for ICs, their build experiences.
We can relate, Justin and I can relate well from that, being employed here at Gradle and constantly trying to solve that problem in our mission to make builds faster for everyone. Thanks for sharing that. All right, one of my favorite questions here, we're getting to that, right? Biggest, I know you kind of touched on this, but you found these bottlenecks. What was some of the biggest productivity engineering wins that you had in the last year that you can share, right? Or it could be even beyond the last year, because last year with the pandemic and all was a very unique type of situation. But what was some of that?
Yeah, and I think this sort of goes to the question Justin was asking earlier from the chat. And so certainly I think as we have brought more of our Windows developers into the IDE. I mean, when our developer productivity team started, it really was most of our developers were using lightweight code editors. And, I say this a little bit in jest, but sort of shamefully not as in jest as I would like. Like a lot of them were using Notepad. Like Notepad was a heavily used code editor. And certainly Notepad++ and, command line. As we bring more developers into the IDE, are able to give them experiences like IntelliSense. We see that they're happier. We see that they're more productive. And so, that's been a big win. I think another one sort of on the more human side of things is, we had seen early in the pandemic that maintaining a healthy work-life balance was challenging. And this is, data that our developer productivity team found by going and surveying a bunch of developers. And we saw 78% of all of our developers were noting that a healthy work-life balance was a challenge. And we saw that people weren't taking their normal rhythm of vacation days. And so an experiment we ran in our org, or in an org of about 4,500 people, is we said, all right, we are going to take a shared break. Like we're all going to take 2 days off, a Friday and a corresponding Monday, as just a way to step back and pause. And what we found is that PR volume for those, the Friday to Monday, that 4-day span, PR volume was a third of what it was the corresponding 4-day span in 2019. But what we found is that in just the 14 days coming out of those shared vacation days, we made up for all of those lost PRs. So if you zoomed out 2 weeks, you would never know the org took vacation days. But burnout wasn't mentioned as a top theme, as a top challenge for 14 weeks after that shared time off. And so we didn't actually lose any organizational output, but we provided meaningful relief to our developers. And so like that all came from our developer productivity team, looking at not just the tooling, but the human factors that impact our productivity and our well-being. And like both of those, the tooling improvements we've made, as well as some of those cultural improvements, are things that I'm incredibly proud of.
That actually cues up another really good question here that came in from chat, which is, what is more important for your team among individual engineering productivity? Among your team, is it individual engineering productivity, or is it like the CI tool chain stability, speed, and scalability of CI, that the tool chain itself? It's another good question.
Yeah, it's a great question, that I will try to refrain from having too much of my own personal bias, but the vast majority of our broader engineering system team is focused on what happens once that developer has completed their PR. And so, how do we integrate all of that code, run all of our compliance checks, do sort of our integration testing, ship it out to the world. The vast majority, like I said, we have a 300, 400 person engineering system team, and we have a couple dozen people focused on those like IC experiences. I think that balance should be shifted a little bit. But it is, today we're still learning how to do some of that more IC individual focused productivity. And we do focus more on some of that system level productivity.
I love that. I love that balance that you guys have, right? Just Justin and I's role talking to these productivity engineering teams from all over the world and all sorts of organizations, shapes and sizes. The one thing is, like, you have to have the right tools. You need to collect the telemetry. You need the visibility, right? But sometimes we forget about the human factor. There's so much focus on data and the tool chain. It's like, hey, the human factor is also, love how you guys are really heavily looking at that and investing in that. Justin, do we have any more, or could we go into?
There is one more that came in that I was going to kind of let it sit, but I think this actually is kind of a good time to maybe talk about it. And that was just basically, and you said this is, you mentioned something that this was relatively new at Microsoft, which I think is such an important topic. Like, the idea of productivity engineering is really new to the industry. So I think this is actually pretty relevant. Have you had trouble convincing executives to invest? And we have the same thing at Gradle Enterprise, right? We have championing exercises that we do. But have you had trouble convincing executives to invest adequately in productivity engineering? And if so, what strategies have worked well for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, like any product team, of course, we have less resources than we would like. There's opportunity cost of every investment we make. And if we're investing more in developer productivity, we're investing less in some end user facing feature. And so, like, I do think there is tension there, but I think it's a healthy tension because it makes sure that we are making really deliberate and targeted investments. And the techniques that I've used is, again, being very just like customer obsessed and data first. And so it's not just looking at clearly identifying where there are bottlenecks and what clearing those bottlenecks can do. And so I'll look at things like, hey, if we reduce build time by 10 seconds, and we know how much developer time costs the company, I can quantify in dollars what that is worth to the company and like how many developers that's worth. And that is a technique I have used that seems to be very helpful, but also being able to tie it to human outcomes has been incredibly helpful. It appeals to the human side of all of our executives and being able to show that, hey, if we focus on productivity, not only do we get more sort of value out of our devs, but they are in fact happier developers and they are less likely to leave. And like things we can do to cut down attrition matter a lot. And so it is being able to look at some of this data, be able to put some price tag on some of the data, but also being able to show it through a human lens. And so like when I go and make my pitches to execs, I almost always on my slides, very PowerPoint heavy here at Microsoft, I'll have a chart with some data, and then I will have some interview quotes that put that data into context. And that's been really powerful for me, I've found, in convincing executives, where they can see things like, oh, hey, I see that performance of this part of the workflow is going down. And then we can see devs saying like, oh, this like makes me want to quit. I hate this. Like, it's driving me nuts. And it's like, oh, maybe we do need to go and address that.
And we're getting close to kind of the closeout here, and one of favorite topics here and questions to ask is, what's your developer productivity engineering moonshot? Right, you guys have come this, or what's
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Otherwise, we get sort of too caught up in the, hey, what are we going to do over the next 6 months? So, when I think about what it is that I want my team to be producing, is like our like little tagline is we want to be the toolkit for frictionless innovation at Microsoft. And so it's how do we remove all of that friction? And so it's, Microsoft today is still relies often on big, beefy physical dev machines sitting under desks. And so, how do we take advantage of some of the scalable, shareable, and like secure benefits of the cloud to help reduce some of that friction by being able to apply more compute resources, being able to sort of share build artifacts more freely, things of that nature. And so it's how do we modernize the development environment by truly embracing the shift to the cloud, which is incredibly important to us as a company. And just how do we continue to identify those friction points, those bottlenecks, so that our engineering system isn't sort of an anchor to innovation from our developers, but it's actually a tailwind. And so it's developers don't have to wait for things to complete. And in fact, how can our engineering system team be helping developers, write better code the first time? And so providing better insights, being able to, help them address, compliance and security issues earlier, when they're writing the code as opposed to when they're completing the PR, things of that nature. And so it's really how do we turn that engineering system into a tailwind and reduce all that friction? And we think the way we're going to start getting there is moving our development environments to the cloud, which as we now move to a more hybrid world where developers may be developing from anywhere, that becomes increasingly important too.
And what do you think would have happened if Microsoft or your team didn't invest in productivity engineering? I think it's we've got to explain all the wins that you got, but yeah, what do you think would have happened?
I mean, this is going to sound super self-serving, like anything that I say, but like I do think we would have higher attrition. I think that and that would come because our developers were less happy. And I think we would be producing less product for our end users. And so I think we'd have negative customer outcomes. And I think we would certainly struggle more than we do today in keeping, our top talent, because like developers today have a lot of choices out there. Like there is no shortage of competition for talent. And so not only do we certainly want to be producing the highest quality code at the fastest rate we can, but we want to be, keeping all of our high quality developers. And if we don't focus on improving their day-to-day experiences, we're not going to be able to.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that.
And that's one of the favorite stories that we have around here, right? Where he was talking about when we were talking with some of the engineering managers at the leading technology companies like Microsoft, that they were talking about, talking to fast following technologies, or even like legacy enterprises. And those enterprises saying things like, I wish that we could, have the level of engineering talent. And these fast following technology companies being like, where do you think we got them? We got them from companies like yours. We got them from companies like yours where you weren't taking care of the developer experience. So.
And to wrap up and get to the final questions, we have many folks in the audience here that are potentially looking at starting their own productivity engineering teams or thinking about how to do it. What kind of advice do you have to folks that either want to get something going or don't have anything or have something now and they're starting with a small team? What kind of advice can you give to the audience?
Like any product, it starts with customer obsession, is what I believe. And you got to, it all started for us when we started being more diligent about talking to our developers and understanding their day-to-day pain. And I think that's where any team really should start, is you have to build a good understanding of what does that day-to-day frustration look like for your developers and what really is that opportunity. And that's the first place to start. And then, as it was sort of alluded to in the question about convincing executives, you do have to find the way that you're going to frame those positive business outcomes. And there are lots of different techniques to do that. Some executives can be swayed entirely by looking at, hey, we think we can raise satisfaction by this amount. And some executives are going to want to say, like, all right, what is the business value in dollars? And I think in this space, you can do both. But it is really customer obsession and then being able to frame sort of your projected business outcomes, just like focusing on any other product, I think.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing all of that. And I mean, you heard it here, folks. You need the right tools. You need the right team. You need to collect data. You need that visibility. You need that telemetry, right? And yeah, without that, it's hard to, almost impossible to do productivity engineering. And we love how, Brian, you shared the human factor of it, that us looking so much at tooling and data, sometimes we may not look as closely at.
I loved
Awesome.
hearing about the urgency too, yeah, I mean, and I throw around this statistic a lot right now because it's so relevant, but the idea that IDC has predicted 65% global GDP transformation by the end of this year. If you haven't already heard that statistic, go look into it because it's staggering. It effectively is saying that 2/3 of what we'll be paying for globally by the end of this year is going to be software services. That means a dearth of developers. And that means, I think, more than ever, an appeal to really take care of developers and do everything we can from a technology perspective, process perspective, leadership perspective to make developers happy and comfortable. To that end, we do have a couple of more questions that have kind of come up. This is a great question right here because I love the abstract relationship with productivity. It's how do you stimulate knowledge exchange between developers? How do you deal with people trying to, and a lot of different ways of doing it, but effectively siloing the knowledge or keeping the knowledge to themselves? It's an old phenomenon in software. I've been writing code professionally since the late 90s. It's always been a thing with some developer personalities. Seems like something that could be even more of a problem with remote work. So how do you foster really encouraging engineers to share information with each other?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And as you mentioned, like remote work has changed this. Like we have found that shifting to remote work has caused our collaboration networks to get much deeper but smaller. And so we're collaborating more with a smaller number of people, and that's also then creating these silos, these network silos. And so, a somewhat unsatisfying answer to this is, your corporate compensation strategy can play into this a little bit. Like, are developers rewarded for sort of being the rising tide that lifts all boats around them? Is there an incentive to focus on their own work, or is there an incentive really to take some of that time and help all of the people around them? And unfortunately, a lot of times corporate incentive structures aren't really working that way. I do think having just very explicit sort of team culture around this, as expressed by executives, if your executives are always saying, hey, this is the kind of thing that we value, this kind of thing is important, consider it part of your job, that really helps. I think oftentimes you'll have executives say, once every couple of years, oh yeah, focus on documentation, but no one actually believes it. And so you do have to build a team culture around it. And I think that requires sort of sustained communication about the value of sort of knowledge sharing, and keeping things out of sort of tribalism. And I do think that, focusing on our collaboration tools will help here, but are not the only answer. It's as we shift to remote work, and it's actually just a little more difficult to collaborate, that's going to only exacerbate the problem. But I think this is a culture issue as much as anything.
That's a really good answer, right? I mean, education, culture, and knowledge culture, and transparency culture is so important, especially now for making sure everybody stays aligned, right?
Yeah, and I just to add on one thing to that, one of the ways that we sort of address this in our team is we have one dedicated day every month that we call it our day of learning, where it's you're not supposed to do any of your normal feature development work. That one day a month, you are able to spend learning about any topic you want. And so to make sure everyone has set aside time for learning. And as part of that, we also encourage people to host sort of sessions where they will go and teach about a topic. And so and that's, something that is highly valued. And we set aside time in order to have some of this knowledge sharing. And so because it does take time.
Those are, I mean, some companies I've heard them called like SME Fridays, subject matter expert Fridays, or brown bags. Obviously, I love that. Any type, yeah, just a great excuse to get engineers together and get their brains ticking. So, and then along that line too, you mentioned a compensation structure, or I'd say reward structure for people who are really embracing productivity metrics and things like this. Do you personally use indicators? As another audience question, do you use indicators to coach developers at an individual level? And these are specifically for their ability to work productively remotely within the productivity engineering constraints that you defined, either for technical level ups or soft skill level ups.
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is something that we haven't quite cracked the code to yet. But definitely we want to. Like, we are still learning, as I said, like we're still relatively new, we're still evolving. And so we're really looking, thus far, our successes have been us sort of internalizing the data and looking at tooling investments or organizational sort of process changes. And what we haven't been able to do successfully is like, how do we take some of these learnings and get them in front of developers to sort of have them be able to up-level their skills and say like, oh, hey, this is, maybe how I am behaving differently than developers at that next level above me. And like, okay, like where are my patterns different? Like even things like, all right, my code review participation, like how is that different than like developers at that next level above me? My documentation writing, like how is that different? And that's something we definitely want to do. We haven't quite gotten it down yet.
Thanks everyone for joining and for the great questions, and of course thanks to Brian and Microsoft engineering team for allowing him to spend this time with us and share this valuable knowledge and experiences with the community. Thanks, Brian, and thanks for the Gradle team for sponsoring this event and being open to allow Justin and I to do cool stuff like this to share with the community.